Today, we're going to be talking about exploring facilities relevance in a changing higher ed environment. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has been the strategic inflection point no one saw coming, casting facilities leadership and the role of the physical campus in a new light. Conversations around the long-term implications of budget allocations, staffing changes, mechanical systems improvements, and capital investment strategies were amplified. And facilities relevancy was elevated, and opportunities to bring new realized value to the entire institution were identified. So how do facilities leaders seize these opportunities and position themselves to confidently respond to the trends that are redefining the future of higher ed? That's what we're going to be talking about today with our all-star panel of guests. Today, we have Dave Irvin, Associate Vice President of Facilities for Florida State University, Lander Medlin, Executive Vice President and CEO of APA, and Pete Zarad, Vice President and Market Strategy and Development for Gordian. Welcome, guys. Are you there?
Yes.
All right. Lander's there. Dave's there.
Good
And
to
Pete.
see you.
There we go.
I love that.
We got everybody on the screen. It worked. How's everyone doing today?
Great.
Great. Looking
Good.
forward to be here.
Well, good. Well, thanks for joining. Really excited about the discussion we're going to have here. And Dave, in particular, I'm excited that you actually made it because I know there's a tornado warning where you're at right now. So if Dave gets knocked off, he has a good excuse there, but hopefully that does not happen. And Lander and Pete, excited to have both of you here on your big media tour after finishing up this State of Facilities report. You guys are doing this, and I think you're going on Fallon and Jimmy Kimmel later today. All right. Well, I'm glad you fit us in. So So for those tuning in, of course, we're going to be discussing really a lot coming off of the back of this year's Gordian State of Higher Ed Facilities report. And we have pinned inside the chat on the top right-hand corner. If you've not downloaded that already, you can click on that. I think we can bring up a cover of that report up on the screen so you can see what it looks like. And if not, you can also go to Gordian.com, and right on the homepage there, you can also download it. There's a lot of wonderful insights in this year's State of Facilities report. And, each year at HEFF Live, you guys have, Gordian and Sightlines in the past have presented on a lot of the findings, but this past year, a lot has changed. And this report is very insightful, gathers a lot of wonderful information on the state of facilities. So, but I want to get into, what we're here to focus on today. Today, we're going to be talking, not necessarily, there's a lot of things in the report, but today we're going to be talking specifically about facilities relevancy. So, Pete, Lander, why do we want to discuss that today? I guess, Lander, Pete, let's hand it to you first.
Well, gosh, I thought Lander was going to go first. That's exciting. Well, delighted to be here with everybody. Thank you for that. I think what we learned this year in a time when everything shifted suddenly back a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, was that schools needed clear, assertive, deliberative decision-making. I mean, they needed kind of decision-making that exists in facilities offices all the time, where things are normally fluid, where choices have to be made due to deadlines or regulations or process on campus or safety or cost. And now we have the pandemic forcing decisions. And that kind of deliberation is not always readily available on every campus. And so it was really crucial to have facilities leaders out in front when so many of the issues tied to facilities issues. And similarly, we needed people who could really translate technical issues to an audience that is often unequipped to talk the technical language. And I think we've found countless situations where facilities leaders really stepped up and showed that strength of being able to translate what is in their world into the rest of everyone else's world, so they could begin to understand some of the concepts that we've all grown so familiar with in the last year.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. So Lander, same question. So why the focus on facilities relevance?
Well, the fact that we went from last March 2020 with days to get students off the campus and home. We're doing a lot of reactive day-to-day kind of work. And then we just exploded into the planning cycle for a fall opening and then a spring reopening. And we did all of that in a way that wasn't just about the technical source of expertise, but as strategists. And I want to really reinforce that word strategist, handling complex industry-wide problems and issues. We were assisting with decision-making at the highest levels. one of the things that I thought was so amazing with the fall opening was how facilities professionals realized you can't do this alone. We really needed to garner the experiences from the rest of the campus community. So organizational silos went away. We started utilizing each other across student affairs, academic affairs, no matter where they were, in order for us to change the very nature of what we were going to do to deliver remote and in some cases hybrid learning. This changed the very nature of collaboration. And I'm here to tell you that change is something we don't need to leave behind. We've got to make sure that we move forward with that kind of change. You know, the last thing I'll say about this, Michael, is that we led our institutions through that phase of recovery, and that leadership will actually determine our continued relevance. We can't shrink back from this role. We need to lean into it now even more so. And we'll get into a lot of that with respect to the areas of expertise that we bring. But it means reimagining space and rethinking culture. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Lander. So, you know, I guess the next question I have for all of you, and is how is the role shifting, and why should it? You know, how would this leadership be valuable within the institutions more broadly? Anyone want to take that? Maybe Dave?
Dave will.
Oh, Dave, I think you're on mute.
Oh.
No, you're not. Not anymore.
No, you're not.
Well, I'll start that and tag team a little bit off of what Lander said. I think what we learned in the past year, well, a lot of lessons that are applicable not just to the pandemic, but lessons that really should apply to facilities and how we serve our institutions in a transformed campus after the pandemic. Basic things like, how do we make our buildings safe and healthy? How do we use smart technology to leverage that? How do we use space? How do we utilize space? Those are things that, as facilities folks, we're uniquely qualified. That's our wheelhouse. But we haven't always been asked those questions, and sometimes we've had to insert ourselves into conversations. The pandemic made us front and center, made us lead a lot of those conversations, and I think it helped the campus understand the expertise and the professionalism that many in our areas have, and allows us now to sort of expand that conversation and say, let's not lose those great lessons that we learned. There's things we learned in that crisis that really are relevant for how we serve our students, how we serve our faculty and staff better. And that's why we're more relevant. We've always had that knowledge, but now there's an understanding that that knowledge and our expertise and experience can really be leveraged for this transformed campus and really be leveraged in new ways to serve what we need to do going forward.
So Dave's so right. It's really about engaging differently, isn't it? It isn't anymore do more with less. It's doing different with less. You know, that slide that we have about Jim Jackson and his quote, look at that. I mean, this is so true in terms of what has happened. We were struggling to have a seat at the table. We were, and I don't necessarily mean a butt in the seat, but influence. And that influence is so important when it came to COVID, the use of technology and data, and it's going to be even more important. But he said sitting at the table, but maybe even sitting at the head of the table. And to me, that is so fantastic in terms of the way in which a facilities professional needs to see their role. And it means we're going to have to take a little bit more risk. It means that we're going to have to step into things that we didn't necessarily do before, but they need our leadership. They need us to be flexible, adaptable, and to help them improve the decision-making on the campus. Maybe, Pete, when you talk about this, we could pull up that other slide. Who is it, Harry? I'm trying to remember, but the slide that doesn't have any data on it. I mean, I love that slide, and I'm going to say something before you do, because that slide is so exciting. It doesn't have any numbers on it, and I know it freaks everybody out. What do you mean no data?
Which is the implications for facility stewardship.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
We can
That's right.
It's a story. It really quickly gets to the concerning issues that exist, that are looming, that are right in front of our faces, that were before, right? We can't shrink from them. We need to lean into them. and we need to have strategies and problem solving. Grab that one, Pete, because Pete, you've really got some cool things to say about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Lander. I mean, I think this has become a staple in conversations that I've been involved in the last year, and it does appear in the state of facilities again this year. And, what Brian was helping us talk about and continues to be relevant is that the past trends that we were dealing with continue forward, right? And the risks and the issues around operating these campuses hasn't gone away. And we are going to see enrollment changes in the future, like we saw in 2020. It's going to come back. And we are going to see, therefore, net revenue drops if we're not careful, like we've experienced in the last year. And that does translate from most campuses to a loss in facility spending. And the only one thing we do know it's going up is the need to spend on our facilities because, things continue to get old and wear out, right? So the reality is that those risks and reliability issues that were onerous in the past are going to continue to be a part of our future on these campuses. And what, Lander, you mentioned this notion that stewardship over the past year has been a comprehensive activity, right? We've broken down silos, we're collaborating differently, we're coming together to solve problems. And what Dave was pointing out was that it's clear to address some of the changes that have happened in the last year. It's going to take facilities mindsets, facilities knowledge and understanding, and facilities skill sets really to help shape these things going forward. One of those skill sets that comes to mind all the time for me too is the capacity to tell stories, right? We've had to teach people how to understand things in a different way. It's not just that we need to repair things because it's broken, but because it needs to serve a particular issue. It needs to make the air in your space healthy, right? That too much complexity has cost, and we're going to have to deal with that complexity if we're not careful. And so telling those stories about why we can't get too fussy and fancy, right? Connecting that to real world situations has been a part of the past year. And maybe, most of all, I think there's a story going on about space going forward too, right? Space has been the big issue. Do we have enough? Are we spread out enough, or do we have too much now because there's nobody on our campuses? Yeah. I think the question becomes now, is space really an asset, like it's recognized on financial statements, or is it more of a liability, right? Is it a debt? Is it a drag on the school's potential going forward? I mean, and it's the kind of story that's really, I think, uniquely interesting to come from a facilities professional, because we think of them as people who are busy capturing and holding on to their facilities turf. But the reality is most facilities people really truly are stewards and want to help the school use it the right way going forward.
Yeah, so that brings a nice segue into the next thing that I want to discuss and around space is, as campuses grapple with remote work and maybe even more remote classes, how are they going to be looking at all the space that they have today? Dave, I want to ask you that, since you're living in that right now.
Well, we are, and I think there's a fundamental shift in how we should look at space, and I'm not sure all of every institution, all of our profession has recognized that. But it has changed dramatically, and it needs to respond to the trends that we showed on that one graph. I'll maybe share a few things here at Florida State that we're trying to do to recognize that. We were in the middle of actually a new campus master plan, and it started pre-COVID. And the master plan was pretty traditional, showed lots of buildings, beautiful renderings of brand new malls and brand new buildings, all kinds of landscape, more grounds, more square footage. And just about the time we were ready to go forward with it, COVID hit. Well, we've now taken a completely different look at what our master plan is. We've dramatically reduced the number of buildings. One, because we don't think we need that space. We're going to use space in different ways. And two, in recognition that there are not going to be dollars there. Mm-hmm. So our master plan is looking not just at what's it going to cost to build those buildings, but what's it going to cost to maintain them? What should we be putting in an endowment for deferred maintenance if we build these new buildings? Maybe we need to do more renovation. Maybe we do need to do some partnerships with folks off campus in a different way. We don't need the same kind of classroom space. Maybe we need hybrid space or places for collaborative team projects, but not huge lecture halls, because we found that actually for huge lectures, it works better on Zoom, where there's a better connection between that faculty member and the 500 people that they're trying to teach. So we don't need to build huge new classrooms. So we've taken a dramatic look at what we're doing in our master plan. We've completely changed that and said we need to look at renovation, we need to look at space utilization, space management, as opposed to trying to build our way out of the problems that we have.
Yeah, yeah. Pete, I know we were discussing, and you provided some slides here about the demographic cliff. And I think if we could bring those up here now, I'd love to have you and Lander and Dave even talk through it, kind of give your thoughts on it.
Absolutely right. The slide that's on the screen now is actually a clipped out of Nathan Grau's latest book, The Agile College, and in it he's continuing on from the work he started, telling us all back in 2018 about the demographic cliff that was coming in. And in these graphics now, it's a great book, by the way, if you get it time to read it. In these graphics, he's pointing out that we're going to continue to actually see general population increases over the next few years, right? The cliff trips back when the recession hit back in 2008, 2009. So you got to jump 18 years from there, which gets you to 25, 26, right? Middle of the decade. So there's still a potential for more students to be available in the coming years. You see the drop off in the graph in the lower left with the pandemic. But importantly, the long-term trend is that we're going to see a drop-off in total students available across the country, and it isn't just a standardized issue. He breaks it down into many additional categories. One of those groups is by kind of type of school, and he breaks it down into sort of those top-tier elite schools. The U.S. News and World Report top 50 colleges and universities, and maybe the nationals are like the 50 to 100, and then everything else, the regional in the upper right and the 2 years is kind of everybody else. And what's interesting about that is the 2 years and the regional 4 years kind of mimic almost exactly that graph we saw on the previous page. The more popular, the more successful schools, right? The more elite schools see a more stable environment in the future and growing. And so demographically, it's going to vary differently when you experience these challenges, if at all, in some cases. I think it's also important to note maybe that it isn't just demographics, right? It's the total misalignment. Lander, you and I talk all the time about this misalignment between how much space we have built versus how much space is really necessary based upon enrollment. And these graphs are talking to it. And Dave, you were speaking very specifically to that very issue in terms of what you're thinking about there at Florida State.
Yeah, we're looking at, like all of us, we don't need as many offices. We had several buildings that were basically just office spaces and large auditoriums. We've taken those out of the plan now. We're looking at touchdown space and hoteling and all the things that private industry's been doing for years, but saying a lot of those lessons learned, or a lot of those examples are things that can be applicable to higher ed. That's a different paradigm. We've never said that before. We've always said we were different. Well, we are different in some ways, branding and other things, but we have similarities in other ways, and we can learn from some of those examples of private industry, of ways to use space more efficiently, because they've been trying to do it for decades.
Well, I guess there's obviously an upside to the pandemic, right? I mean, we've been hosting a lot of these roundtables, our mastermind series, and the most popular topic, of course, is really trying to figure out this whole challenge around space and who's coming back to work and what it's going to look like. So, I guess what does a campus look like then going forward? Does a shift to hybrid classrooms and maybe even more remote learning fundamentally change how campuses work and are organized?
Well, I would dive right into that. Connect the dots to what Pete just talked about, giving you the backdrop and the context for what's happening, and then tie that nicely to what Dave was talking about in terms of the reality of space can be viewed as an opportunity, not just a burden, and how they're going at it. I mean, there's a whole different way of thinking about what's happening in terms of college and what we're all trying to do. The Atlantic article from Ian Bogas last October, November is really at the intersection of this. It talks about the college experience being even more important than college education. Now, I know our faculty don't like hearing that, but the bottom line is students are thinking about that experience. I mean, they did great things to try to get onto our campuses, right? So this idea behind the remote hybrid classroom learning environment and the remote hybrid workplace is absolutely huge. So the fact that, and Joe Bellata taught me this, he said at University of Iowa, and he said his own entity, but Joe said, you got to remember they're in the learning environment for maybe 5 or 6 hours, and then boom, they're on the move. And what we do with the informal interactions and the casual collisions, we call it, becomes so important and needs to be considered. And I'm going to use this word maybe several times today, intentionally. We must be much more intentional about the environment we're creating for those to happen. And it's really how we move forward strikes at the heart of our institution's culture and commitment, because it really does have profound ramifications. You know, the last thing that I'll talk about with respect to this, with at least at the moment, is, you know, students are not all hating the remote environment. So it's how we build to think about and how we lean into the remote online plus the physicality. This shared physical experience is super important, and it needs to be a well-defined sense of place. We have been doing some more on a thought leader series around connection, space, and place, which I can talk about that in a little bit more. But indeed, we're moving to this even remote hybrid workplace as well. And I'll give you some examples of that after Pete and Dave have some opportunities to talk about what they're doing.
Yeah, and I just want to pause for a second here and remind the audience that, you know, throw in your questions. I know we have a couple that have already came in, and we'll get to them shortly. But if you also have any comments, we'd love to hear from you, and we'll start getting to those in a few minutes. Yeah, so Pete.
Hey, Dave, I wanted to ask you what it was like for you guys on campus right now. I was hearing a bunch of media stories, you know, to land to your point about students wanting to be on campus and take advantage of the experience. Funny thing, this week, right now, the media is picking up on the fact that everybody's leaving campus, right? They're all heading to spring break locations. But the stories are saying they're still the schools aren't having spring break, so they're just taking classes remotely. They're taking classes on the beach. They're taking tests in their hotel rooms, right? They're to your point, they want that experience, and that experience is above and beyond what happens inside the four walls of a classroom. And we've now liberated the capacity to do that. And I assume that even there at Florida State, where you're so close to the beaches, they must just be running there all the time.
Well, they are, and we have complexes with pools, in which they take well advantage of. As you've probably seen the visuals in the media. I think that raises a really good point in terms of what our buildings are, what are the stories they tell, and how does that work into the brand for our university. The demographic cliff tells us that for most institutions, we've got to figure out what's our role, what's the unique identifier for our institution. And some of that is place-based. Many of it is not, because they're going to be doing things virtually, whether they're on the beach at spring break or they're logging in and taking classes remotely, like a Grand Canyon University does. So as facility folks, we need to think about more than just, is our HVAC working? Is our building healthy? That's certainly important. But we need to be part of the conversation about what are our facilities telling, and what's the story and the branding they're doing for our university as a whole. It's a key part of what we have to do marketing-wise, and a key part of that experience, whether they're entirely remote, hybrid, partially remote, or they're on campus. And I think that's a different kind of mindset than we've traditionally had as facilities folks.
Yeah.
But I think we're uniquely qualified to be part of that conversation.
Yeah, Dave, can I ask just a follow-up question just for you specifically, I guess, you know, in Florida here, is that, you know, how are you getting people to work together, right? With more people working remotely and stuff like that, you know, the culture, going back to the culture thing there, is there anything that you found that's been allowing, you know, communication better? How do you find that?
I think we're all kind of struggling with that, and we're probably all sick of Zoom meetings, but we're doing a couple of things. I mean, even for those folks who can pretty much work remotely, we're finding that having a morning or an afternoon when the whole team gets together in person, even though that's socially distanced and masked, that interaction, that face-to-face, can't really be captured. And so we're saying, yes, you can work remotely primarily, but there are times when you need to come together in touchdown space. And so we're thinking about, what does that look like? What does that space need to be laid out like? It's probably not the standard conference room with tables and chairs. It's probably much more informal, sort of the third space that Starbucks has been doing for decades now. So we're thinking about those kinds of things being a place where we can make those connections in a different kind of way than the standard sitting in a meeting, sitting around a conference table.
Yeah.
there are different ways that we need to be thinking about that connection. It's a great question, and I think we need to look at it a lot more.
Yeah, I mean, it's all industries right now, obviously, that are really trying to navigate that question. Pete, you look like you want to add something.
Yeah, there's a slide that we have that we could pop up that just has a quote from Mike McCormick out in Washington.
Yeah.
And it talks about this issue, right? It talks about this question of trying to understand the value of space. What is the value of space? What does it mean to come to work? It's speaking right to the things that Dave was talking about, right? Why do you come together? What is the purpose of being together? I think we were together before in the past, maybe just because we thought we were supposed to be together sometimes, or because people didn't trust each other, right? There's a trust issue in there. And now we've learned that we can be productive. So it changes that, and maybe we can get away with a lot less space, but I think to Dave's point, we're appreciating, and particularly I think facilities people who've been on campus this entire time, right? Everybody else ran away, and our facilities professionals stayed there on campus to make sure the place was still up and running and doing all of the basic things. Has learned what it means to be together and what things have to happen there, and they're getting a chance to think about what are the spaces that are really truly crucial to deliver services in the future. But the culture is very, very different when there's nobody on campus. So we also want to make sure there's a place. Place comes from people, not just the buildings and the objects. They create the environment for that experience of place, but you have to, that connectedness, right, that Mike talks about in the quote, right, has to be built around a place, but it's going to be a different kind of place, a different kind of environment, no matter what their student population is going to be going forward.
This is what everybody's doing right now. They're looking at that chart, like really close to the screen, trying to look at the numbers.
Yes, there we are.
It's in the report. It's in the report.
It is in the report, but it is a really insight. That to me in the report definitely stuck out, because when you look at obviously the growth of space and the enrollment numbers, I mean, there obviously needs to be an adjustment there.
So Mike, could I add one comment, and it's around this workplace remote hybrid learning.
Yeah.
And it's about the fact that all of this is affecting people, and we want to use space very differently. But just like we need to create those intentional, casual collisions and informal intersections for students to learn with other students and with faculty, our people, and there's a term that we got from one of the town halls we just did, called "people miss being disturbed." Now that sounds sort of funny, right? But it's the informal drop-in conversations you have in the hallway in the workplace that make a big difference in terms of fomenting ideas. And the other thing that Pete hasn't said that really struck me, he said it several times to me. He said this forced disruption revealed a new trust in working productively remotely. And it links back to space and our needs for leadership in this area, and how we can get the best of all possible worlds, but not negatively impacting health and well-being. And I think those were super important. That Pete's been teaching me about that. So
it's funny you talk about the sort of activity thing. I was just hearing a former colleague of mine talking about this, and some students surveyed themselves this winter, and one of the things they said they desperately want is noise. They're just tired of being on a campus and it being so quiet. They want that cacophonous energy that we all think of when we go to a campus. And they're like, build it for us, create it for us, just stick us in a room. But we want to hear the noise, the energy. Yeah. It's amazing.
Isn't there an old song, "Come On, Feel the Noise"? Yeah.
Yeah. Who is that? Was that Twisted Sister? Who is that?
That is Twisted Sister. We're all showing our age.
Wow. Wow.
I apologize for that.
Maybe it wasn't even. I'm not even sure. So we do have a question that I guess we'll pause now. So it's a question related to one of the earlier slides. So the slide showed of the trend of 18-year-olds and those going to college over the next many years, had those lines getting closer and diverging. What factors year to year influence the projection of what percentage of 18-year-olds will go to college in a given year, and how is that predicted? And that's from AVP of Facilities at Swarthmore College.
Andy Fike, maybe.
Andy, nice to see you, Andy.
Gotta be Andy.
So in Nathan Grau's book, he goes over a number of different factors, and it talks about availability in certain cases. It talks about different economic factors that are going into place. It talks about the mix in the social cultural combination of students and their interest and propensity for going to school. There are a number of different factors that he gets into over many pages, actually, in the book about why those numbers diverge. But an indication is that there will be more students available of that age, but many of them just aren't going to be. They're going to be going off to jobs. They're going to be going off to tech things. They're not interested in the college experience. And I think there's a subtle acknowledgement that we've heard and seen pressure around the country where there's a little less glamour associated with colleges and universities, right? There's a lot more skepticism about the true value that's happening in higher ed. And so I think it's not going to affect places like Swarthmore, let's be honest. It's not going to affect places like that where there's going to be a draw, but it's going to affect the overall population. And we saw, interestingly enough, in the past year, in the community colleges, right, we saw a tremendous drop off in ability to attend school because of economic forces or concerns about other things that are going on in people's lives, right? Just the capacity to take care of your children, other sorts of factors have kept students away from schooling in the past year. And it's things like accommodations, things like that he looks into and projects over the next year. I'm glad to just follow up with Andy directly, and we can do like a whole book review thing together. It'd be fun.
Well,
Awesome.
Besides Andy's situation at Swarthmore, which may not, and for probably 200 schools, not as negatively impacted, there will be way more competition for students, way more competition even for international students. But there's a piece here that we didn't mention, and that's the increasing numbers of Black, Hispanic, Latinx, Asian, and those students, the marginalized, underrepresented, but are greater parts of the population, need support. They need support in some really wonderful ways that we now, besides financial support, we understand, but the tele-everything is what I call it. That's actually working for these students because they're feeling like they're getting more coaching, mentoring to help them get through. And that's going to be an important angle to this change and shift in mindset that Dave mentioned earlier too. Back to you.
Yeah. I was going to say, let me tag team real quickly on Lander's comment and share an example. Here at Florida State, there's probably other examples other places, but we were looking at additional space for our counseling. To Florida State's credit, they have a very robust support system for students. And if you would have asked pre-pandemic, all of those folks that are in counseling would have said that has to be face-to-face. It's so intimate. We've got to have that connection and that exchange. What we found during the pandemic is for some students that is required. They do want that. But there are other students, either because of where they're located, the logistics, the other things going on in their lives, or maybe they're a little more retiring and introverted. For them, the virtual experience, virtual counseling, telemedicine works better. And so we found that it's not one model, it's several models. And again, that gets back to space. It gets back to how we use space. It gets back to the original thing we were saying. Why are we relevant? Because we're understanding those trends, and we can help our colleagues on the academic side figure out how to navigate.
Great. So I want to just jump to one more question, then we'll get back into a few things here. And this was an earlier one, but it says higher ed facilities are becoming more expensive to build, operate, and maintain. When do you think a third-party science laboratory might be built for a college based on a long-term lease? It's kind of a topic that's out there.
Great question. We're already seeing it for academic buildings. There's a number of universities that are doing public-private partnerships for academic buildings. I think it's coming a lot sooner than most folks would expect, whether it's partly federally funded or it's privately funded and leased back. I think that's coming, I would say, within the next 5 years, if not sooner.
And building on collaborations that are already happening, in urban centers where there are partnerships, places like MIT have collaborated with other businesses and they create think tanks and, incubation centers right there on campus or adjacent to campus. So the line between the entities is kind of blurring very quickly already.
Well, that was from Massachusetts Division of Capital Asset Management, Scott Callisti. So there you go. Someone up in your neck of the woods up in the Northeast. Okay, so moving, I guess, on similar, I guess, to on what you were just talking about, Dave, is a question for you is, with remote programs again happening as you're just discussing, is does the way that students identify with the campus start to change, specifically like thinking about the brand?
It does. Traditionally the brand was walking across campus and that interaction, and that may still be for a lot of our students, but many of our students really are going to relate first, and recruiting absolutely first, in terms of the virtual environment. And so that changes the nature of what we do. We're looking at a University of Tennessee, for instance, just did a student union. And one of the things they looked at the union was not just the traditional ballrooms, but what are Instagram moments in the building? What are things that we can that when students come through, they'll take pictures of, and it will resonate on social media because they knew that was going to build the brand of the university. And so I think it very definitely changes what we're doing.
Yeah.
So we just did this, Mike, on thought leaders, connection, space, and place, and they talked about that very thing. The iconic images tacked to and contributing to an institution's brand, doing things to create lasting memories, promoting that sense of community. I'm looking right at them. A welcoming environment, no matter whether you're coming in virtually or you're coming in to the physical space. And then psychological and physical safety were other parts of this sense of place and creating an identity with your actual brand. We know we have some really crummy spaces. Some of the residential experiences, now that they had to live in those spaces more than they wanted, really need to be, we need to pay attention to them. But there are also these spaces for that diverse population that I mentioned. And so I'm not trying to add to the space problem, but to really rethink and reconfigure how we consider even our space standards. We got to modify that and update that because it's going to require some strategic decisions. Back to you,
Michael. One of the things I'm really liking about what the things that these guys were just saying was that we're continuing to circle back on this idea that facilities leaders and facilities offices have a relevance in places that people don't think about. You guys were just describing enrollment initiatives. You were describing sort of publicity and PR issues. Dave, earlier you talked about campuses that extend far beyond the walls of the sort of central campus proper. And in all those cases, it has been tempting in the past to confine the sphere of responsibility or the sphere of understanding or engagement for facilities officers and leaders to just that core campus and just the functioning of it, right? You were saying earlier, making sure everything's working. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the reality that these folks have a really invested opportunity to affect the quality of the student experience, the quality of the educational experience, the quality of the research experience, but also really the quality of all these other pieces of the institution far beyond the walls, the outside edge of what we think of as the campus proper. And I think it's just a phenomenal moment, and we don't want to lose this. I think that's what this conversation is about. We're not losing that momentum that has been gained in the past year, that understanding that relationship.
Yeah, 100%. And for those that may know our large organization, Influence Group, we speak with facilities leaders in all the different verticals, and the role of facilities has been elevated in all industries because they were at the forefront of the pandemic, and everyone looked at facilities. So, and I guess that brings into another area here is the pandemic's raised expectations around health and safety within the built environment. So how do you see that driving investments in existing buildings and future developments in terms of, with providing a safe and secure environment?
Well, I would dive into that one. And it's around, there's a great quote that I think we should hear from the report. It says, short-term responses to the coronavirus had the unintended consequence of establishing a new floor for what constitutes a healthy space. And that is such a powerful statement because that's exactly what transpired. I mean, the indoor environment is a key determinant of our health, safety, and productivity. It's part of the total cost of ownership, but we got to remember the importance of balancing human health and human performance. And so the ways in which we're thinking about it is that the general public now knows what a MERV 13 filter rating is and means. That can be great, and it also can be a nightmare. We're also finding, and my comments would also center on smart technologies. And then I think, Dave, you can pick up to this MERV 13. You got a great story about it, and also the smart technologies, but they can be aided by these smart technologies. And we need those tools for a more set of predictive analytics to make good business decisions. But the other part of these smart technologies is they help us capture places for energy and energy conservation. They help us capture how our O&M delivery system can be streamlined from reactive to predictive to preventive to predictive through predictive analytics. And they also help us think about occupant, which is the largest cost of all those three costs. And the more that we can think about it, I think the better we'll be. So maybe, Dave, you can tell your story about the MERV 13 rating.
I think it's a great story to talk about our relevance and certainly how facilities has been elevated. And I was pulled into a faculty meeting this week because they had read an article coming off of CNN. It was taking some things out of context from CDC recommendations. And the headline of the article was, "You need to open your windows."
Huh.
And so faculty was asking, well, how can we do this? You're telling us our windows don't open. We want you to change our building and make all of our windows operable. And before I could answer the question, one of the other faculty members said, well, do we really need to do that? Because in our building, you've changed to MR13 filters, you've increased the airflow per hour, and we have mold issues in Florida. So why don't you talk about more comprehensively how you keep our building safe? Because it's not just about a CDC recommendation, which allowed us to have a really great conversation about what we were doing and why we were doing it, and that it was more than just a headline of opening windows. I wanted to pay the faculty member who raised the question afterwards. I think it's a great example of us being in conversations we haven't been before with an audience that expects more and knows more than they did before. Mm-hmm. And so I think we're going to need to use every tool at our disposal so that our buildings are not just healthy, but smart. How do we take the reams and bushels of data and use that in a smart way? You can use it to, for instance, figure out how do we target where our custodians go? How do we target when filters need to be changed, what we need to do in terms of servicing buildings. We found, for instance, that there are places where we probably were overcleaning, and we could move that resource to those high touch points, those places that were really critical for faculty, and they appreciated that kind of change.
Yeah.
I think those are the kind of things we're going to need to do in order to take those resources that are very scarce and meet that new floor.
Yeah, well, that open windows actually made the front page of the New York Times again yesterday. Yeah. That's the study coming out of Harvard. And, we've been organizing roundtables and bringing facilities leaders together for the past year because, again, you've been tasked with becoming epidemiologists and virologists to understand how, virus is transmitted, and that's not, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. Mm-hmm. But, I always think of higher education as the industry that really pushed LEED and sustainable buildings. Do you think that there's an opportunity here for higher education to be a leader when it comes to things like well certification and really kind of using university environments as like a living laboratory to promote healthier environments?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we need to seize that opportunity.
Yeah, and he doesn't give himself enough credit. He fielded that and then fielded it like a strategist, and he ran with it in a way that other folks may shrink back, and I don't think that's what we want to have happen. It is to have a much broader conversation and discussion about it. I do think that the sustainability piece and with climate change, et cetera, is a critical part of all of this because it's about healthy indoors but healthy outside, and there are a lot of people designing more outdoor spaces, maybe not in the heat of Florida at the moment. There are lots of places. Pete, I think you have some really great comments about this.
Well, in this particular case, I was thinking about the fact that you're all doing the storytelling, and I mentioned storytelling earlier, right? And I think that this linkage between health and welfare and the performance and the scaling and the space, right? It's the connective tissue. It's building on the relationships we've built over the past year, right? Dave's story about faculty kind of listening and paying attention, something being able to carry it forward. It's APA's work right now, linking healthy and smart together, understanding that smart has been out there for a while, but everybody has seen it as kind of an expensive tech toy, right? Yeah. And now we're saying, no. It's about creating that environment, getting above that floor that Lander talked about of satisfactory health conditions. That kind of connectivity, that kind of relationship, that kind of storytelling is what's moving people forward. It's what's transitioning them and giving them an ability to see and understand the importance and of some of the things that these facilities people have been talking about for some time, because they've gotten visibility and because they're being characterized in ways that are much more understandable and translatable today than they were if we were just talking about needing a new toy, but better controls, right? Yeah. Even more energy efficiency, which is nice, but it's distant. Energy efficiency is like, that's somebody else's money on most campuses. And so I can't invest in that. But if you're going to make my space safe for me, if you're going to make the environment outside of my campus healthy and better so that the oceans don't rise or whatever the issue is that motivates them, then that's a much more rich way to engage people. And I think we're seeing the benefits of that and people demonstrating their capacity to do that in the last year.
Yeah, we have an incredible opportunity, folks. Here we are with space being reshuffled like never before to meet actual need. We've been at this space management, space utilization for how many years? I mean, Dave doesn't have hair now. Okay, so that's becoming over, right? But some institutions are centralized, some are decentralized. This is a rare moment that we don't want to miss because we are the drivers of that. Joe Bellotta again told me that the deans at University of Iowa see facilities as their best friend because they're now seeing a measure of and a level of expertise of ways of thinking. They're going to drop probably 5 buildings. That's the way they're thinking. They've got some really different things to consider, and here's our opportunity. So back to you, Michael, because I think you have questions.
Yeah, so we do have a question here from the audience, and it's, how do all of you, I guess, account for potential funding from the Biden administration providing a pathway for learning to so many students who would not have been able to before?
Well, let me say something, and then they can dive in, and that is it's a $40 billion number, which is well below the $183 billion that we need. There is good aid, and they're trying to push for more for the Pell Grant for our students. That will be important, but it's nowhere going to meet the needs that of the expenses and the revenue losses that we experience. That's just the reality of it, Mike. So others, you want to chime into that?
Yeah, I would tag team on that. Is it welcome? Absolutely, and we will use it well and effectively, but it doesn't change the underlying conditions. It's the slides we started with. That's still the overlying trend. It was a trend before COVID. COVID's accelerated all of those trends. So maybe there'll be a brief pause where the trend isn't as overwhelming. But we as facilities folks need to recognize those trends and push that conversation, stay in that conversation. The Biden administration or whatever happens from our political leaders at the state and federal level, let's hope that they understand the need, that they commit to higher ed, but we can't count on that. We have to make decisions and chart directions that are sensible and that speak to where students are and where they want to be and where they're going to be. And that's different than where they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
Yeah, and Dave, one statement, and that is public perception. Pete, you mentioned that. Dave's mentioning that. The public perception is waning. That's a scary, scary thing. And I don't care where you are on what political side, that is true. So if we can get our hands around that in a better way, because we take advantage of this moment and do things differently, I really think we have an opportunity to change that perception. Mike?
Yeah, and I would just add that the federal money, it is such a complicated issue because the response and how it's going to be used changes in each of the 50 states, right? And so it depends on where you are and what you're doing and what's happening. I also think it's important to remember that the kinds of investment that schools have been making have been above and beyond what everybody else is making across the country. The efforts that schools have gone into to create safe environments, whether that's changing classrooms, whether it's doing testing on a regular basis, whatever investment they're making, it's significantly beyond what a lot of other institutions are doing. And so I don't think it's realistic to think there's any way to recapture all of that, let alone use that stimulus money to advance anything else on campus. At best, it's going to offset some things. And because of the way the language is written, it's really focused on helping students, right? It's to help offset some supply costs, but the bulk of that money is really focused on helping students get back in and get re-engaged, which is in the end going to be the best thing for the institutions. But I don't think the schools themselves should think of it terribly much, particularly in the facilities realm, as a significant offset to anything near term or going forward.
Yeah, Lander, just a quick question. Andre Hutchinson from San Diego asking, did you say they're going to drop 5 buildings? If I heard that correctly.
Yeah, at Iowa.
What did you mean by drop?
I should have said demolished. They're removing. It looks like as they're looking at space use differently and ways in which they're considering the remote hybrid workplace and learning, that they believe, given the condition of those buildings and given where they're headed, that they have the opportunity to do that at Iowa. And that he said publicly on that town hall we did on February 19. Now, the opposite is true. University of Kentucky, Paul was on that, was a panelist, and he said, we're not seeing it as much because it's so dispersed. It's in too many different places. We just can't co-locate it. And so they're not seeing the possible benefit that Iowa. So it really is a unique thing, and each institution is going to have to get their hands around it, just like this topic.
Right, and Iowa, to your point later, Iowa's been working at that for years, right? They've been thinking about and plotting that for years to try to sort through what their opportunities are. So they were in a better position than some other schools are today to think about those next choices. It doesn't mean you can't get there and rethink those things, but I think to the point, when these changes happen, they happen dispersed across the whole campus. You have to really spend some time figuring out how you're going to coalesce to be able to remove an entire building, let alone 5.
Okay. We only have a couple minutes left here, and again, there's a lot of stuff that we're discussing, a lot of stuff in the report that we obviously not getting into. So, is there anything that we did not bring up, Pete, that you think that we should address to the audience and all your raving fans that are tuning in live right now?
Raving fans. That sounds almost dangerous.
Social justice, the staffing issues.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I think we haven't touched on the obvious challenges to staffing, right, that are out there, and I think that's something we all need to spend more time talking about. There are going to be tremendous changes because of layoffs and furloughs and the changing technology we talked about, and the need to shift the kinds of employees we may have in the future. Maybe even the kind of capital program may shift because it moves from a build more to renovate more. So I think there's some big issues there. Certainly, we haven't touched on at all the social justice issues, really that are kind of been reawakened and really need to be addressed. And I think facilities officers have a particularly unique opportunity to help participate in that conversation because of where they sit and how often we find that the employees working in facilities organizations are much more diverse than they are on some of the other campuses and the communities that they're in. So I think that's really important. We only touched a limited way on climate change. So I think there's a whole realm of things that we could touch based on climate change. All of those things I think are part of the report. I guess I did want to ask if we could pull up the quote from Rhonda Gibler, which we used in the report, and it's become one of my favorite quotes. And it's this one, and it's an encouragement. It's a finance officer's encouragement to everybody to think about the future. And I think she's challenging schools to make decisions about near-term challenges with an eye to the long term. It isn't prescriptive about the decisions. And it doesn't say that everything must be made with an eye to permanence, right? It's not saying everything needs to be made of granite and slate. What it's saying is that choices made today should be made with an eye to what's going to serve the school best 30 to 50 years from now, right? The same way you would if you were looking to set up your own retirement. And the mental flexibility that's required to do that is what we've been talking about today. And it's just the kind of skills that I think facilities leaders exhibit on a regular basis. It's the kind of skill that they've been exhibiting over the last year to make sure that we're making as few foolish adventures as possible. We can hear plenty of stories about tents that didn't work out and questionable, installations of things, but trying very hard to provide the best resources. And it's certainly going to be the kind of flexibility and nimbleness that we're going to need in the future. And again, why the kind of creativity that we're seeing in people like Dave and others across the country is exactly what we need in leadership across campuses going forward.
Yeah. So we do have a very important question from Mark Helms. He wants to know where he can get autographed copies of this report.
Only Mark would ask that question.
Oh, that's so funny.
There we go.
I love Mark.
Well, listen, we've got a couple minutes left, and obviously we can go over about a couple minutes. But I know there's always people that it's like, they got to hop to their next virtual meeting. So if you do got to go, make sure you download the latest State of Facilities report. Again, it's on the it's the opposite when I'm here. There it is. State of Facilities report. You can get it at Gordian/higher education, or just go on the Gordian website. But it's also linked in the chat there. So you click on that, you can download the report. And maybe if you're lucky, it'll be like a Willy Wonka thing. One person gets the autograph one. It'll be the lucky report. But listen, this was an excellent discussion, and even what you're just saying, Pete, the topics around climate change, social justice, these are conversations that I think we should maybe discuss, even hosting further discussions on. They're very important.
I think that'd be great.
Lander, I'd like to thank you for joining. And this is actually the first time we've ever done something with HEFF and APA. And it's a privilege to have you. I obviously saw the amazing work that you did, in particular since the pandemic with the town halls. Phenomenal. We tuned into a lot of those. So amazing work that you're doing at APA. And Dave, of course, congrats stepping into the president role there and managing to get on a webcast today with a tornado heading your way. So thank you so much.
Well, I want to thank you, Michael, for giving us the opportunity, for giving me the opportunity. You do great work in this space. We're really appreciative of that, as does Gordian. And we're all pleased to have the opportunity to work together. We are breaking down silos too, aren't we? This is organizational engagement.
I love it.
Let's do it.
Well, and Pete, last but not least, but obviously thank you and to Gordian for the support of HEFF over the years. You guys have allowed us to keep on chugging along until we can get back to live events, which we're planning one for the fall, hopefully. With that being said, I know it's top of the hour here, so we're going to say goodbye. But we have one more slide that has everyone's information that can come up on the screen here. Again, thank you to Gordian, and for Pete, Lander, and Dave, if you want to follow up with them, they have their email addresses there, but I'm sure a lot of you have their information to begin with. There's a lot of friends I know tuning in. So thank you. And I guess a couple of just plugs for HEFF is our mastermind series. We've been running these roundtables. They've been very productive. We actually run a number on the topic of return to work and what is that looking for space. We're running sessions on indoor air quality, on sustainability. So you can learn about those sessions at higheredfacilitiesforum.com. We limit those to just around a dozen or so facilities leaders. So it's really essentially like a roundtable at a regular conference. And then, of course, HEFF Live. We are planning HEFF for November at the PGA National Resort, Golf Resort in Palm Beach. So Mark and Dave, we at least can hopefully see you guys there. It's only a drive. But that's November 7th through the 9th. And we are still rethinking what the experience is going to look like. It's going to be responsible. But just like HEFF, it's going to be all about connections and conversations, and a lot less staying in a ballroom listening to some speaker on stage for hours. It's going to be more about conversations and hopefully mostly outdoors. So thank you guys. Be safe and hope to see you again soon.